Hey there, everyone. Welcome to First Look. Hopefully, I can do this again because I just recorded all of this for you a couple minutes ago and the audio didn't work. And so now I'm recording it again for you. So we're just going to pretend like this happened one time for you and I'll just get past it. So, all right. Anyway, welcome to First Look. Thanks for being here today. As now we're entering into a new era. This is we're moving into the post Steph Martin era. We had a wonderful send off for her. It was a mixture of sad and glad for her and all the things that goodbyes are. And she is right now, I think, about to get all packed up on the truck and she's headed to Louisiana. And so we wish her all the best. And it's, one of those colleagues and friends that you hope that you get a chance to work with at some point, and I'm glad that I did. And I know that the Presbyterian world is small, and I know that that will continue, but it is a sad thing. But to try to put something light on something that is otherwise sad, I've been trying to think of how we would talk about this next little era. Because we're looking for someone to be our new director of spiritual formation, who will be working with children and youth moving forward. And so we have this kind of air gap of time in between now and then. And so I've been trying to figure out some things to call this little mini era. It's like the solo album, Ben's solo album. Or Ben Unleashed or something, not Untethered. I don't know what to call it, but if you have a good name for this gap of time, which could be weeks or could be a few months or who knows, go ahead and give me an idea of what we should be calling it. Because now I don't have this other partner in crime to kind of make sure that I'm minding my P's and Q's, so anything could happen, and isn't that exciting? So we're starting this new era with a passage that is very familiar to you. And before I read it, I'm just going to give you a little bit of context. Now, this is from Luke chapter 12. And this passage then happens, just a few verses after the Lord's Prayer. So that's the one that we were just talking about. We were talking about debts and debtors, and we were talking about give us this day our daily bread. And then we move right in from that passage into this one. And the kind of subtitle for this one is the parable of the rich fool. So we have, this is an interesting passage because the context matters a lot. The parable is sort of said to a crowd. He said it to them. But it's really pointed at this one particular question and one particular person. So it's not said to the Pharisees, it's not said to the disciples, it's in response to one man's question, who asked him this question about inheritance. And so Jesus has this response, this initial response, and then responds to this person kind of adamantly, and is trying to teach him something, and thus teach everyone there something, and then teach us something. So that's where we are in this passage. So this man comes up to Jesus, and it starts like this. And again, this is chapter 12, starting in verse 13. Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me." But he said to him, "Friend, who set me to be a judge or arbitrator over you?" Now, let me say, since this is my first look, here's the research I haven't done. I don't have any idea if it's okay for this person to be asking for any portion of this inheritance. On face value, and that's all I have in this moment, inheritance was kind of controlled by the eldest son. So my guess is that this person is not the eldest son, and is asking the eldest son to share either his portion, the portion he should be getting, or share more of it with him. The way that it's sort of set up, it kind of makes it feel like that he's asking for more than he is legally or socially obligated to receive. And so it seems like the person doing the asking is asking for more than he deserves or more than he's supposed to get, and is going to Jesus, making this public, kind of airing this family laundry out there. I guess with the hope that since Jesus doesn't seem like the kind of guy that follows all the rules all the time, that maybe he will side with him, and then he can go to his brother and say, hey, look, I asked Jesus, I asked the prophet that everyone's talking about, the one who's all radical and whatever, and he said this. I think that's what we're supposed to gather from the passage, but I could be wrong. So Jesus is saying, look, I don't even know why you're asking me. And I think the reason he's asking is because of who I said Jesus was, because he really should be going to some legal person. And maybe he has gone to some legal person and didn't get the answer that he wanted, and so now he's going to Jesus. And so Jesus decides that he's going to talk to not only this man, but to the crowd, and then of course to us, about how we see the world and how we see money. And as we know, Jesus talks about money more than just about anything. He talks about love and he talks about money. He talks about the love of money, but he talks about them separately and together all of the time. And famously, there's so many things that the church argues about how we should think or feel about lots of different things that Jesus doesn't cover at all. But Jesus talks about love, and Jesus talks about money all the time. And those are usually subjects that we would like to avoid, which I think is interesting. So, moving back to Luke chapter 12. So he starts off saying, am I supposed to be your arbitrator? And then he goes into telling him this parable starting in, let's go to verse 15 first. He said to them, take care, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Again, making me think that maybe this person is asking for more than he's supposed to get. For one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions. Now, I guess on one end, we could be thinking that he's talking about the guy who's doing the asking. If the guy who's doing the asking, who's going to Jesus and saying, tell my brother to do this, maybe he is the one who is being greedy, right? Like, it kind of makes you feel that way, that like he's addressing him directly. I guess on some level, if I'm really trying to think about this story differently than we normally hear it, maybe he's telling a parable about what he hopes the brother can hear. That the brother is being the greedy one and storing up these things for himself and not giving them. So if we thought about it, it could be that this story is really for both of them. Maybe the brother's there. He's saying, because he's talking, the guy who's talking to him says, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me. As far as we know, the brother could be standing right next to him. They could have been there in the crowd, and he takes this moment to kind of air out the family laundry, and his brother's standing right there. And so, as far as we know, this story could be for the guy who's doing the asking, but it also could be for the brother, because maybe the brother actually hasn't done what he's supposed to do. I hadn't really thought about that before, but that's why they call it a first look. So it could be that that's true for both, true for all. Something to think about. Keep that in your mind. Okay. He tells them this parable. The land of a rich man produced abundantly. So it's that man's possession, right? It's his land, he's done it, whatever. Just like it's that guy's inheritance. I don't know. The land of a rich man produced abundantly, and he thought to himself, what should I do? For I have no place to store my crops. Then he said, I will do this. I will put down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and all my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, You fool, this very night your life is being demanded of you, meaning you have things to do. And the things you have prepared, whose will they be? Meaning you can't possibly eat or have or use all of these things. So it is with those who store up treasures for themselves, but are not rich toward God. Now, there's a lot of things in that passage besides what I just mentioned that I think you have probably heard before, and I don't think that I'll probably do a better job of talking about than those who have come before me, which is us considering the abundance of what we have, the privilege of what we have. You know, there's a privilege, of course, in this guy having land, because if he inherited that land, then he's being given something that not everyone is given. Not everyone inherits land. Not everyone is in a position, born into a position to have their land produce. And in this society, not everyone is born first. And so that society and our society come with its certain hierarchies and privileges, and those are things that are more than worth our time at looking at. And people who are much more skilled and who have been doing it much longer have probably given you that sermon. And it's a worthwhile one. And thinking about how we feel about money or protections or inheritances or any of those things, any of the things that Jesus talks about all the time, are more than worth talking about. And Jesus has to address, lots of different folks. He addresses the poor and disinherited and those who aren't going to have all the things that some people do. And then he also addresses individuals who are, who feel like God must love them more because their lives have gone well, because they have abundance, because that's the way they thought that maybe the world worked. If you are doing well, it's because God, thinks well of you, that kind of thing. And so in this new kingdom of God that Jesus is trying to usher into the world, he's realizing that a lot of what he has to talk about with people is showing them a different way of living, that this kingdom that he's building will be built on new rules and won't be the way that it has always been. All those things are true, and all those things are more than worth your time in thinking through and discussing and really, looking at yourself, looking at the way you feel about your resources, what you're willing to give to your family and who you consider family. And, it starts to think about empathy. It starts to think about all those things, right? That's the part of the story that we look at the most. And it also is a fairly common passage to look at if we're thinking about tithes and offerings, right? Because right there at the end, there's a kind of plug for that, right? There's that element that says, are you building up treasures for yourself or are you giving to God? And it kind of makes it feel like, of course, that, hey, if you have a lot of, income, or if you have treasures in heaven, then, the church could use some of that. And that's all true. And that's all worth our time. And, those are all, again, worthwhile sermons to hear and to think about, how we give of ourselves and what does that mean for the ministry that we can do together. All of those things are very important. But you've probably heard them before. And, there are seasons for that. And that's an okay thing too. So I decided to call this passage, even though this is a first look, I did look at it a few months ago and I gave it a title, and I believe I called it Brothers Divided. And so this passage, in this passage, I'm not looking at the parable itself. I want to look at the brothers themselves. Because regardless of how they got here, whether the brother who's doing the asking and saying, hey, my brother needs to give me the inheritance, or the one who has the inheritance, either way, whoever's at fault, whoever's in the wrong here, whether he's asking too much or he's giving too little, we still have this really strained relationship. And even if the brother who has the inheritance gives the other one who's doing the asking all the money he's hoping for, will they ever be right again? Will this ever work again? And one of the things I started thinking about as I was sitting down here was just thinking about the sermon that we just did, because we just talked about the Lord's Prayer in chapter 11, the chapter right before this one. This is in chapter 12, that was chapter 11. And I was advocating for the idea that Presbyterians say, forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. And I was talking about Jesus and his mission and the year of Jubilee, and I was talking about wholeness and reconciliation. Because realistically, debts between two people are different than my debt to an entity. Like, if all of my debts were cleared, right, and everything was like at zero, then that would mean something good for me. You know, it would obviously, you know, I mean, it would be beneficial if that was true. But that's to an entity. You know, I'm repaying debts to companies. The company and I are not going to be made whole, even if it was made. I don't know what I would do for the company that would make that whole. But if I owed a debt to another person, and they owed someone else owed a debt to me, and I decided, or they decided, to let that debt go, or I decided to let that debt go, whether it was a physical debt or not, what would that do not only individually between me and that other person, but what could that mean in societies, right? We're talking about a kind of way of looking at wholeness and reconciliation. Because whether it's physical debts or the debts we hold on to in terms of like trespasses and sins and what have you, the wronging between two people. What we're really talking about either way is a lack of wholeness. And the whole point that I was trying to make with the Lord's Prayer is that there's a lack of wholeness that Christ is addressing, and trying to make the world a more whole place, and doing so through the lens of poverty, forgiveness, grace, social and economic justice, that kind of thing. Because that's what the Jubilee addresses specifically. So using that as kind of the base point, how do we then pivot to this story here today, which could be a story about money, and I guess on some level it is, but the angle I'm choosing to look at this time is it's really a story about reconciliation and relationships. And that if we all just assume that at the end of the day, or at the end of our lives, we're all going to die, and we can't take it with us, and it won't mean that we have a better spot in any eternal something in heaven, you know, then what we really have in terms of richness is the way that we treat and the way that others and the way that we seek out reconciliation and wholeness, that's the life well lived. No matter how many trips to wherever you go on, the relationships that you have are the ones that really that matter, and how we work to reconcile them. And so what I decided to focus on with this passage is what all of this means for the two brothers, and how things can get in the way. In this instance, it's money, but on some level too, their feelings of fairness and equity and are off. They're either thinking about themselves when they could be thinking about something else, or they're thinking about the legal ramifications. Well, the law says it should be like this. Are they looking past what they can get away with or what they think they deserve, and are looking for something more or looking towards something more? And I think that's a big part of the story, and part of the reason I think that not only has to do with the Lord's Prayer part, but also the other passages that kind of go between the Lord's Prayer passage and this one, because some of what is talked about before is this story about Jesus denouncing Pharisees and lawyers, and that's really about power, right? So these individuals we're talking about. Woe to the Pharisees, for you love to have the seat of honor in the synagogues and to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces. That's about you're using what you have and you're abusing it. You're not creating, you're in a position to make other people's lives better, and instead you're worried about, how you look in public. So all of that kind of thing happens right before this. There's a warning about hypocrisy that happens here in the beginning of Luke chapter 12. And so Jesus is on this arc between the Lord's Prayer and this passage where he's talking about the ways that we see ourselves in the world, and we see how we take advantage of others for our own gain, and how we could be setting up this world and this kingdom of equity and justice and wholeness, but instead we look at it through our own lens. And that's what I think he's doing with these two brothers. So that's what I started to think about for this week, and I'm hoping that it might give you a way of looking at this passage that's a little different. The ones about how you spend your money and tithing and offerings and all those things, those are really faithful things to be thinking through. All of us should be thinking about how we spend those resources and what we do with them. But I think it also has to do with the ways that how we enter into the world and the relationships that we have with each other, and what we allow to take center stage in our thinking, and what we could be doing alternatively to that. So that's the way I'm approaching it, as a way of thinking about healing relationships rather than just one that contemplates our economic resources. So that's what I had for you this week. I hope that is useful. I hope that you kind of get a sense of where I'm headed. I needed to obviously do a little research into how inheritance works at the time, and so that I have all of those things straight for whenever we actually discuss this on Sunday. Your homework, as I said, is to think about whether this time period should be called Ben's solo album, or it should be Ben Unleashed or something like that. What we want to call this little time period, because that's the only way I know how to have fun with it. And so any comments you have on that are welcome. Well, anyway, while you're thinking about that in between now and Sunday, I hope you have a good week. I hope that this passage is something you can kind of ruminate on, and adds a depth of richness to to your days here. And I guess I'll see you next time for another first look. So thanks again and take care.